could think like America is one entity, that thinks and acts together. And you just have to point out that America is not one thing. It doesn't have just one mind and acts with one purpose. Most of the wars happen around the region where I live, but not in it, because the politics of the region that I'm in is that we are an underpopulated area. And after oil was discovered, there was a deal with America to protect us in exchange for selling our oil in dollars. That was the deal struck with America. So America would protect this area from foreign invaders, which before them, the British were in their place.
And this was one of the major results after the end of World War II, that the U.S. demanded that Britain turn over its aegis in the oil region to the U.S.
That's true, yeah. But typically in this region where we live, we have not encountered the direct effects of war from America. I mean, this is a really peaceful region, and it's governed by monarchies. And that's maybe one of the reasons why they can't, it's very difficult to tax.
That's, of course, Hans Hermann Hoppe's great book on democracy, The God That Failed. He talks about why, in fact, monarchs have a much harder time taxing than democracies.
I read that book. In a monarchy, you would imagine an absolute ruler. But over here, how things work is that there is a consensus among the ruling tribe, and they rule by consensus. And there is a way of letting your opinion reach to them, and you can share opinions. There is a system here, and it's quite stable. I mean, I would prefer to live under a stable system than a system that has people that have never been in power, and then suddenly they're in power, and then they want to direct the government to do different policies in their favor for their interest group, as happens in a democracy.
And as Hans points out, a monarch wants to improve and conserve the kingdom for his descendants, whereas a democratic politician has every incentive to rip off everything during his limited term of office. He doesn't care about the future, doesn't care about what happens to the country in the future. He just wants his take, so that monarchs don't rip off their own people. They can't get away with it, but they also don't have the incentive to do it because they want to preserve something very, very valuable for their children and their grandchildren and far into the future.
That is true. I mean, I feel it's much easier to improve upon a monarchy than to improve a democracy, because once the majority takes over, the majority is not necessarily right.
No, and of course, as David Gordon, David, our great philosopher, points out, he says, in all of political philosophy and all the literature of political philosophy, he said there's no place does anybody make the argument as to why the majority should be able to rule the minority. He said, because he says, there is, of course, there is no argument for that. But this is just assumed. Well, of course the majority should run everything. Again, it's how come the minority can't live their lives? Why do they have to be run? There are a lot of myths of democracy. And yeah, I think there's no question you've got economically and from a personal liberty standpoint, in many ways. And by the way, there's not entirely free speech in this country either. Maybe there was in the past, but that's being increasingly circumscribed here. We have our problems. And, one of the things I want to, a lot of people think, and you pointed out that this is probably a result of colonialism, but a lot of people identify with Islam with socialism, but there really is no reason to do that, is there?
That is true, and a lot of modern socialists looked at Islam and took a socialist interpretation of it. And there are some figures who showed socialist tendencies, but when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad, he was a businessman, and he had no problem with private property, with commerce. And he has some very nice things to say about businessmen. If I could quote you this
yes, please,
from the Prophet. He says, "The merchant who is sincere and trustworthy will, at the day of judgment, be among the prophets, the just, and the martyrs. The trustworthy merchant will sit in the shade of God's throne at the day of judgment. Merchants are the messengers of this world and God's faithful trustees on earth."
Wow.
I mean, I don't know if you've heard similar things, but it sounds very. He praises just businessmen. There's a story I'd like to relate. In Medina, when the Prophet migrated from Mecca, the second place which he lived is Medina. There was I think it was a famine and a shortage of food. So the prices of food started rising. People started putting pressure on the Prophet and telling him to put controls on the prices. He was reluctant to do that. Then he went away and to contemplate and see if he'll get a sign from God of what to do, or a message from God. But he came back and he said he didn't get any message from God that he should do anything. So he said prices are in the hand of God. He resisted a lot of pressure and didn't intervene in the prices.
Well, not exactly the kind of thing you hear in this country.
It's
from our religious figures either, of course.
It sounds a bit like Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Are you optimistic about the future of the Gulf region? Are you, from a standpoint of you're very interested in, you've done a lot to help spread interest in free market ideas and Austrian economics. Your father too. Other people very, very interested in terms of writing. And how are things going from the standpoint of spreading the ideas of liberty?
Well, it's a very slow process, and the first thing I'm doing is trying to translate books into Arabic, and just put the literature out there. And it's a very slow process. And for me, a lot of the insights of Austrian economics helped me within my business to be able to analyze and diagnose problems and improve things. But in terms of the region, there is a move, but it's coming from the government. Employ more local people in the private sector, because right now you have a lot of locals working in the public sector, which is the government ministries, and there are state-owned enterprises. And in the private sector is dominated by foreign workers, expats, like Indians, mostly Indians, Pakistanis, but the management are mostly foreigner. There is a move to reduce the number of Bahrainis in the government sector, but it's a very slow move, and unfortunately they're trying to use the force of the law to increase wages, increase the minimum wage, and I don't see it working. They also imposed a head tax or poll tax on every foreign worker, which it's paid by the company, but then that goes to training local people. But unfortunately, we have a lot of training institutes, and they train in things which are not very relevant to what we do. And if we don't spend that money on training, we just lose the money. So it's a kind of a taxation. It's very little. It's like $10 per worker per month.
Still not a good thing.
It's not a good thing, but I can see where the idea comes from. But in my opinion, I would put less barriers to working and allow younger people to enter the workforce and gain experience through work and not through training institutes. That's how I see things.
Well, Yousif, you're already a leader in business and in free market thought, obviously, in Bahrain, and I think you're going to become a much more prominent leader in the future. And it's wonderful when you come here to visit the Mises Institute. Keep doing what you're doing, and thanks a million for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much, Lew. It's a pleasure being on your show, and I mean, I can't thank you enough. Your institute is what gave me a real education. It gave me the tools to educate myself, and thank you.
Well, that's great to hear, because, of course, that's our goal. So thank you, Yousif. Bye-bye. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.